Welcome. I'm Michelle Conant. I'm the Behavior Assessment Training Project Coordinator. Thank you for joining our first webinar, Implicit Bias and Stereotype Awareness, Viewing Student Behavior Through a Personal Lens. This is the first in our four-part series that focuses on bias. Our webinars are every third Wednesday from 3:30 to 4:30. Our lead presenter is Dr. Deborah Bruns. She is a professor and program coordinator in the special education department at Southern Illinois University. She will be joined by Max Friedman and Mark Winston Griffin, writers and co-hosts of School Colors. School Colors is a narrative podcast from Brooklyn Deep about how race, class, and power shape American cities and schools. And just for a few housekeeping items, if you have any questions, please add it to our questions box. Our team will answer questions as time allows. A complete frequently asked questions or FAQ document, the slide deck, and the webinar recording will be added to our webpage. There will be a few polls during the webinar. I encourage you to participate in both the polls and questions. Please be aware that there will be two separate emails after the webinar, one from GoToWebinar with a link to our exit survey. The other email will be from SIU if you indicated that you would like professional development. The email will contain the ISB evaluation of a workshop. Please return the evaluation via email and you will receive your evidence of completion. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Michelle mentioned, this is our initial webinar in our series for the Behavior Assessment Training Project. We're excited to jump in and share this information with you. Please let others know in your buildings and districts and programs to join in. We will also archive the webinars as we move forward, so you will still have access to them. So I'm Dr. Deborah Bruns. I'm going to kind of start us on a journey today in looking into implicit bias and stereotype awareness and help make the connection to how that impacts our work with our students, and focusing largely, as is the focus of the project, to look at students with behavioral concerns and the impact of these types of factors on issues of suspension and expulsion. And hoping to begin this conversation this afternoon to think about how we view our students that we work with, and then also how we view ourselves in our positions in the schools. So I wanted to kind of move us into an overview of an agenda for today and look at several areas that we will discuss in the hour that we have. I do want to spend a minute or two giving you an overview of the project, and then walking us through a quick activity that will include a poll. So again, as Michelle said, please respond to the poll. That information will help us as we move through this webinar. Then there will be some discussion on some key definitions. And again, throughout this time, if you have questions, please do go ahead and put them in the box, and we will take a look at them and try to answer them in real time as best we can. After Max and Mark kind of give you their perspective on the topic, there will be a little time at the end of this webinar for several self-reflection questions that would be wonderful to have kind of an interactive component there. And then I will walk you through a preview of the remaining subtopics that link up with this initial topic for our webinars on implicit bias. So by way of background about the behavior assessment training project, what I've done here on this slide is kind of highlighted a little bit of what Our focus is, this project is for approximately 2 years with funding and support from the Illinois State Board of Education. And this is in response to a need in the field. And we are doing what we can in multiple modalities to, again, raise awareness on the topic and then be able to support folks in the schools to move ahead and be able to be aware of implicit bias and to be more culturally responsive. So what I've highlighted here is much of the discussion around this project is about functional behavior assessments, or FBAs, and then also about behavior intervention plans, or BIPs, which we know go hand in hand, which we also know is focused on the team of professionals that works with a student with an IEP or a student that we're keeping an eye on through MTSS. And one of the components that we will go into in future webinars is also that piece around collaboration. If you skip down to the bottom of the slide, I've highlighted information about culturally responsive evidence-based behavior interventions for students. And that's an important piece that we make sure to combine. So when we're looking at pieces here, we're looking at cultural responsivity as well as evidence-based behavioral interventions. Looking at the overview of the topic in general for our topic 1 is looking at student behavior through a number of different lenses. What we're going to focus on first today is a personal lens, and the remaining webinars in this topic number 1 will also touch on a contextual lens, a professional lens, and also for the 4th webinar on the topic, which will be in January, we'll be walking participants through creating a plan. So having the information from the first 3 webinars and then actually putting into concrete steps a plan moving forward to address this topic. The second point here, which I wanted to highlight, is looking at it through a personal lens, that it's a process. It's not something we do once and walk away from it, because we change. Some of you out there have been in the education field maybe for 1 year, 4 years. Some of you may have been in the field for 25 or 35 years. We're not the same people we were yesterday. We were not the same people we were a year or 2 ago. So this process, this focus of looking at a personal lens is something we need to be aware of. It's something that needs to be an ongoing part of our practice. And what I want to highlight is when there is the potential to be a mismatch between the two and what that means for us. So if there's a mismatch in some of our perspective around student behavior and what our expectations are, what our background tells us is appropriate behavior, may not be in line with what our students are telling us or our students are demonstrating. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So the next slide is our first poll. And what I wanted to ask to begin this conversation to think about if when there is the potential for a mismatch is what I'm going to ask you to do. And there's going to be 2 pieces of this. You'll see 5 different types of learning modalities listed here. I'd like you to take a minute and think about your preferred learning modality. You may have several that you use in your daily life, in your work with students, in your personal life, but I want you to think about these 5, and I would like you to select one. So visual, oral, verbal, physical, or logical. And then once you select from this first poll with the 5 choices, we're going to move to a second poll with 2 additional choices, and I ask that you select one of those as well. So Michelle, whenever we're ready to move into the second part. Okay, and oh, thank you. Okay, so now you have two additional choices here. If you would select one, as far as a learning modality, if you prefer social, interpersonal, working with groups, or more of a solitary preference. And as you finish that, again, I'm going to ask Michelle to show us the results. And we have all of the information. Okay. All right, thank you. So we have a majority of visual learners in this group, and then the second highest looks to be our physical kinesthetic folks. Okay, and then let's see what the second one told us, if we have more social or solitary people. More social people. All right, but it is fairly close. So then the next slide highlights, I hope to highlight, just the thought of if there is a mismatch. So we discuss a great deal when we're thinking about students with disabilities or students who are at risk for needing special services, that sometimes there is a mismatch. Sometimes we don't know, maybe a student can't articulate what their preferred learning style is. And oftentimes what we will do in our classrooms, and I discuss this here at the university with my students as well, so it's not only in public school classrooms, school-age classrooms, etc., is the potential for a mismatch. So if I had to go through those polls, what I would choose as well is largely I am a visual learner, which will mean that since the visual modality is my preference, when I create materials for class, that is typically the modality that I focus on. Not that I don't include the oral modality or kinesthetic, but that's not my preference. That's not what comes to mind first when I'm preparing for class. So I raised that issue, and what I'd like all of you to think about in relation to that issue is the potential for a mismatch. So right now we're talking about modality. So you may have a child who's very kinesthetic, who can't sit in their seat, who really wants to be up and doing things. We also need to think about a student who really prefers to work by themselves. And maybe in our classes, we prefer to work on social skills. So we think, oh, we should put children in, or put our students in small groups. Well, that might not be within the comfort zone of a student who really would prefer to work on their own, whether they're working with paper and pencil tasks, working on a Chromebook, or what have you. So what I want us to shift to is thinking about the mismatch, not only in terms of academic success, but what that means for behavioral expectations. And as I said a little bit earlier, is we have to look at our own areas, our own focus, our own background, our own communities that we come from, and think about what we bring with us, which often we may not be aware of, but things that we have from our childhoods, from our experiences, from our work in the field, and think about behavioral expectations in our classroom, for the classroom to be quiet, for the classroom to do, to have our students meet very specific expectations for small group work, large group work, and so on. And sometimes there's a mismatch there. There's a mismatch looking at individual students or a group of students and where they come from, who they are, the background they come from, what is acceptable in their home, in their community, in the places that they spend time in, and how that may not be in sync with what our expectations are in our classrooms and in our buildings. And that is something, again, we may think about it, but I think for most people, we are not fully aware of that and what the implications may be. So I want us to consider that mismatch as a potential factor when we look at the high rates of suspension and expulsion for some of our students. So moving on from there, I'd like to take a little bit of time and talk about some key definitions. Again, these may be familiar, and that's wonderful, but I think they also need to be repeated often and intentionally. I know that for us here in Illinois, we have a great deal of conversation right now about fully integrating culturally responsive practices in our teaching. We're supposed to integrate culturally responsive standards into what we do at the university, but I think we have to do more. I think we have to really think about what it means and what the implications are. So I'm going to take a second and read the definition here. Talking about being culturally responsive is being aware, having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference, and the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural and community norms of students and their families. That's a lot. There's a great deal to unpack. I think we could spend an hour just talking about that. But I think it again points to taking a moment and thinking about your classroom, your building, your district. Who are the students? What are their backgrounds? What is their race? What is their socioeconomic level? Many of those characteristics may be very different from our own background and what we bring. And I do want to add, I'm here in Southern Illinois at Southern Illinois University, but I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Queens, which is the most diverse place pretty much on the planet. Am I culturally responsive? Probably to a point, but there's always more to learn. There's always more to examine, because within this definition is we're looking at continually building on our understanding, continually looking at the different cultural and community norms that are around us, because we have to understand them and ask questions and learn about them to truly serve our students. The next slide is another poll. I promise it's the last one, but I want you to think about this question and really think about your answer. Please be honest. It's an anonymous poll, but if you could rate your cultural responsivity, thinking about the definition in the previous slide. And if you answer 1, it's talking about that you demonstrate a great deal. And then number 5 is being unfamiliar with the concept. So I'll give you a minute to respond to that. Okay, and if Michelle can show us the results when they're available. All right. Okay, so the majority of folks, and again, thank you so very much for your responses. About 80% said I demonstrate more cultural responsivity compared with others. Okay, so let's continue on. And again, if there's any questions or thoughts, please do share them. So the next piece I'd like to spend a minute on is another definition. This one addresses teacher bias. And this is something that, again, I think is an important topic to begin a discussion on. My hope also is that you continue with the webinars here for topic 1. When we get to the end of our hour, I will give you kind of a preview of the remaining subtopics that will come, but we will continue to discuss teacher bias, which here the definition that I was able to pull talks about factors that cause a teacher to have higher expectations for some students and lower expectations for others. I think this is very critical, especially coming from with a lens on special education and looking at students with disabilities. We know that there's been definitely a push and very positive outcomes when we look at students with IEPs going into general ed classrooms, for example. But we also have to guard against what often or hopefully not often, maybe only sometimes, when people have preconceived notions of a student with a disability. Sometimes we do need to lower expectations, but I don't think that's the terminology. I think we need to think about the adaptations that we need to make for a student who may have a reading concern, a student who may have a visual impairment. We try to make adaptations and modifications so they can be in that classroom with their peers and work on the curriculum that a 3rd grader, a 7th grader, a 10th grader is actually working on. So I don't see that as lowering expectations. So again, that's more on the academic side. What we do see is sometimes the expectations are different on the behavioral side. Again, going back to that potential for a mismatch. As a teacher, a school psychologist, a social worker, we know about our school culture, we know about the code of conduct and what's expected for our students. And sometimes reading between the lines, those expectations will vary depending on the age of the student, the background of that student, race, culture, all of those types of factors. And again, what we would like to do, one of our focus areas with this grant, is to raise awareness and start having more conversations about the impact of things like teacher bias. And oftentimes this bias is not intentional, but people are not aware of having these lower expectations. And the second point is that this particular situation often creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is, again, the larger issue that we need to unpack and we need to examine, that our responses to some of our students may very well be different. We may have different types of discipline practices in our classroom, that we use one set of practices for one group of students and another set of practices for another group of students. It happens. We need to be aware, we need to accept that this happens sometimes. When we look at the teaching force, I share this with my students. When we look at the teaching force, there are often people like me. They're middle-aged white women, but our students are not. Our students are from other cultures, other races, and other backgrounds. And oftentimes we don't know everything that goes on in their homes. We don't know about their communities in terms of places they go to worship, places they go for cultural activities, and what some of the norms and expectations are, because they may be different than what we're expecting to happen at school. The next slide gives us another definition to think about in terms of stereotyping. I think this is discussed again quite a bit in media, in books, in movies. I feel that we do discuss this a great deal, but I don't think we always discuss it in depth. I also feel that sometimes we don't look at it close enough for ourselves. So the definition I'm providing here is talking about widely held, fixed, and often they're oversimplified ideas of a particular type of person. And there's many factors here. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I grew up in New York City. I've lived now in Carbondale, in a very, very, very rural area for 20 years. I definitely had stereotypical views of folks who live in an area like this. And often stereotypes are not positive. So I did have some negative thoughts coming down here. But I also made sure to do my best to keep an open mind and meeting people here, people who have lived here all their lives, people who have families who have been here for multiple generations. I always joke that many of my students live in a town where the street that their house is on is named after their family. because their families were there when that town began, when the first house was built, when the first road was opened. And I've learned a great deal being here. Do I still hold some stereotypes? I might. I do think about that sometimes when I make comments or I hear people making comments, but I also try to keep it at the forefront to think about and use always as a learning experience and learn more about the people around me. One final definition that I want to share before I turn it over to Max and Mark is looking at just the concept of behavioral expectations. I think we talk about behavioral expectations a great deal, again, with that special education lens. We talk about a student's academic needs, we talk about their social emotional needs, and we spend a great deal of time looking at behavioral expectations. So one of the things I just wanted to highlight is looking at behavioral expectations as guidelines, and we typically look at them as guidelines for all students. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, with that special education lens is we look at individual students. And part of what we do as teachers, administrators, school psychologists, social workers, is we need to get to know the individual student. We need to get to know why that student and how that student ticks. We need to know their preferences. We need to know their struggles. We need to know really and truly who they are and where they come from. And then we make adjustments. Because if a student is living in a chaotic household with many people coming in and out, and that student has learned that the only way they can get attention is to raise their voice, they're going to raise their voice. And then they come to school and they raise their voice. And that doesn't meet our behavioral expectations, because most teachers, most folks in a classroom want the classroom to be quiet. They don't want it to be chaotic with everyone yelling over each other. And that's legitimate. But we also then have to look at our response to the student who raises their voice to be heard, and not be punitive necessarily, but to be understanding that that's what they've learned. In special education, we talk about, the behavioral background that we come from, cause and effect. That's the number one piece that you start with from the behavioral perspective. That student has learned to be loud is how you get attention. And maybe in their home, it may be positive attention. It may be negative attention, but it's still attention. So the student does it in our classroom, and chances are we will respond negatively, and then the student will get louder, and we will get more negative, and then potentially down the road, there's a suspension. So I also just want to add the second note here that these behavioral expectations, we need to think about how they apply to us as the adults. What are the expectations we have in our buildings and our programs? Do they match? Do they match the community? Or do they match this group of us that may be grade level driven? Maybe it's all the 10th grade teachers, maybe it's all content driven, and maybe it's all the math teachers, but what are all the expectations that are tied up there? And how do they then match up? Hopefully they match up with what we look at as behavioral expectations for our students. So what I wanted to do at this point is bring our special guests on, Max Friedman and Mark Winston Griffith, and have a moment or two where they can introduce themselves. And then I have several questions which I've shared with them that touch on the topics that I briefly mentioned and their work.
Great.
Mark.
Hello.
Max.
All right. Good to be with you. Thank you for that setup and introduction. I'll just try to, just kind of introduce us and our podcast, because I think that, we want to be clear and transparent about things that we're a little bit out of our comfort zone, in the sense that, we are journalists who are fairly well versed in conversations around race and class and power, intersecting with policy and history and community self-determination here in New York City. And although we've covered education issues, which, in ways that we will describe, we're not pedagogical experts in any way. We're not behavioral scientists in any way. And so what we can give you is the best from our observations and our experiences as journalists. So just to give people kind of some grounding in school colors, we don't know to what extent you have listened to it, but let me just say briefly that season one, there are 2 seasons of School Colors, one of which is featured on our own podcast platform, the second of which is featured on the NPR Code Switch platform. And we originally did this really as a combination of things. Max was doing some master's work. I was running a community organizing group, and we came together to collaborate on doing some storytelling about, again, race, class, and power, particularly in Central Brooklyn. And so the first season of School Colors focused on Community School District in 16 and really tried to answer this question of how this school district was so under-enrolled. Because the more we looked at that question, the more it pointed to a whole complex web of issues and of history. We went back 150 years in history and looked at the development of the neighborhood of Central Brooklyn and some of the social, political, and economic histories that followed over the last, over those years. And so it was 10 episodes, and it really kind of, it started with this idea of really how are these people in Central Brooklyn, how have they sort of expressed their educational self-determination? And so again, we delved into history. We tackled issues such as charter schools, gentrification, Black middle class, angst, a whole breadth of issues. And at the end of the day, we ended up really trying to generate more questions than answers. Before I turn it over to Max, say that my own history is one of, I've lived in Central Brooklyn most of my life. I've been a community organizer. I've done policy work, and sort of throughout my life, but later in life, I've been focusing on journalism, and I'm going to be a full-time journalist within a few months. And so I'm going to turn it over to Max and have him briefly talk about season 2 of School Colors.
Hi, everybody. My name is Max. I'm the other creator and host of School Colors, along with Mark. And just to be clear about season 1, I'm not sure if you said this, is that Central Brooklyn, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, where we focused the first season, is a historically Black community, historically Black neighborhood, if you don't know New York. Season 2, which focused on Queens, and in particular the part of Queens where Dr. Bruns is from, Forest Hills, is Queens. We focused on one district in Queens that includes a whole bunch of different neighborhoods that is, in fact, people like to say is like the most diverse place on the planet. And the trigger for season 2 was that there was, the city was planning to go through a diversity planning process for this district. And there was a huge amount of resistance from parents, particularly in the north side of the district, to the idea of going through a diversity planning process in a district in a place that's already so diverse. And so that raised a lot of questions. Why would they do that? And why would the district need a diversity plan if it's so diverse? And the truth is, once we look back into the history up to the present, this is a district that for 50 years has had really a north side and a south side, and what people call the Mason-Dixon line, separating north and south, which mostly, for most of that history, the north side was white and the south side is Black. And since Queens became really a magnet for immigrants over the last 50 years, the politics of that have changed a little bit, and that's some of what we got into in the season. Touching on issues like gifted and talented programs in New York City, as well as special education in New York City, and looking at the way that some schools dealt with the pandemic, and just the challenges that schools in a historically predominantly Black part of the district have faced for many, many, many years, and busting some of the stereotypes around that. So I'll stop there. That's just gives you a little sense of the work that we've done. I mean, I think in terms of how it relates to this conversation, I just want to be transparent that we don't primarily talk about what happens in classrooms, although both of us have been teachers. Mark teaches at the college level. I've taught really like the real gamut of K to 12, even though I don't do that anymore. The show that we made mostly focuses on policy and practice, parent organizing. We did in the second season spend quite a bit of time with school principals. So talking about administration as well as like school board politics and stuff like that. But excited to be here in a conversation about how all of that work applies to the work that you all will be doing on bias and stereotype awareness.
Okay, well, thank you. And I have been in conversation with Max and Mark for a little while in talking about the project and kind of the lens that I bring to this, and have shared with them several questions. So if I can, I'm going to kind of toss out one of the questions and we'll take a minute with it. So I had asked a question about mismatch, and your comment, Max, about working with principals closer for the second season. What are your thoughts? And I'm just going to read through the question. What are your thoughts on school professionals, so everyone, in terms of teachers, principals, working with parents and vice versa when there is a mismatch in some type of demographic piece, so race, socioeconomic level, and I think in both seasons you've touched on kind of what the implications are.
You want to take that first?
Sure, I can start that. I mean, I think the one of the things that we were interested in looking at in the first season in particular is that it's the rise of charter schools in particularly in neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and historically Black neighborhoods. But at the time that we were reporting that, the schools, kids in the district, it was about 50-50. Half are going to traditional public schools and the other half are going to charter schools, which was a pretty dramatic statistic. And one of the things that we were able to talk about by kind of looking back through the history is that there is if you look in the history of the neighborhood and of the city, there was a movement for community control of schools. I swear this is an answer to your question. There was a movement for community control of schools in the late 1960s in central Brooklyn, specifically among Black and Puerto Rican parents and teachers in central Brooklyn. That experiment was really brought to an end by a long and very dramatic and ugly teacher strike. Now, this is not me making a commentary on teacher strikes in general or teachers unions in general, but that is to say that there is a long-standing, partly as a result of that strike, although not exclusively, there's a long-standing mistrust between communities of color in New York City and the teachers union. That is just sort of the air you breathe in the school system in this city, I think, whether or not you're aware of it. And so when you're talking about mismatch, if teachers coming into that space, white teachers coming into a Black neighborhood who are not quite, are like, I'm just here to help. Why am I getting resistance? Why doesn't this community trust me? There's like such a deep history of not just from the strike, but even just a history of generations of families in that neighborhood feeling like these schools don't serve them the way that they deserve to be served. And so that mistrust is gaining trust. Gaining trust is really hard and patient work. And I think that some teachers and administrators and other school staff have the feeling like parents really families really have something to prove. Like the families need to prove to them that that they are doing the work that families need to do to support their students. And I don't think I'm not sure that everybody feels the same sense of responsibility on the part of the school and the school staff, that the school and the school staff have just as much to prove to families as the families may have to prove to them. Because there's such there's a well of not universally, but in places that serve predominantly poor students, that serve predominantly Black and Latino students, of families not being served.
Yeah, I'll also add that, if you listen to season 1, a lot of it focuses on a time in history when there was an experiment in community control in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn, which is adjacent to Bedford-Stuyvesant, part of Black Central Brooklyn. And one of the things that the professionals, the teachers who were in that district, part of what they were experimenting with, and part of what their critique of education was at that time, is that there was a really sort of a not just a biased, but really sort of a hatred of Black self that was being perpetuated through the school system. And that they, as predominantly Black teachers, had an obligation to try to push back, to reverse that, and to create classrooms where Black students felt fully affirmed. And so what they did is and what really spurred this, the teacher strike that occurred afterwards, was the fact that there were some teachers who were let go, who were told that you're not serving our students, and they were not universally white, and at the time, which became a big issue, they weren't even necessarily universally Jewish, which was there was a big tension there. But the bottom line is they tried to create conditions where Black students felt affirmed, and I say that because it's a recognition that as a teacher and you're in that classroom, you're a role model, you're a leader, and not just what you talk about, but who you are communicates something. And it transmits something as far as, Black students feeling like that there are people, that other Black people are worthy, or can teach us, and are up to the task, and are leaders in that sort of way, and have our best interests at heart. Now, I will say that when we talk about implicit bias, when we talk about stereotypes, I think it's important to understand that, one, in that situation, there were white teachers who were teaching Black students in a very effective way. And I will also say that there were Black teachers who were teaching Black students in a very ineffective way. And so I don't think that there's this direct correlation between, being a Black teacher, being a Black student, and there's an affirming relationship. That's not necessarily the case. And many times, Black teachers come in with their own, many times, class-based stereotypes and preconceived notions that students have to face as well. So I said, I'll say it's very complicated, and whereas the imbalance can prove to be problematic, the solution to that is not always straightforward.
I'll just add to that briefly that, like, when we talk about culturally responsive education, part of the reason that sort of became the terminology for that kind of work is a recognition that there are just so many cultures in our schools and in our communities. And certainly working on the second season of our show, looking at Queens, made that very, very, very clear. And so the idea, I mean, not only that, but to say, like, there's no, even within a culture, that culture may not be singular. Like, there's no single Black culture, for example, right? So the idea of being responsive to the culture of every single kid in your classroom is I think a great thing, a great place that we've come to in terms of the way that we talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Can I just say one last thing, which is, I think this is not something we can answer right now, but I think it's also worth looking at when you talk about this imbalance, that the assumption is that we're talking about Black or students of color or low-income students who are being taught predominantly by white teachers or people who don't look like them. Very rarely do you see in this country the reverse. Very rarely do you see a situation where a school of predominantly white students are being taught by Black and people of color. And I just think that it's something that, you know, it doesn't just reflect on how we're teaching the students, but how we regard the value of Black teachers as well, and teachers of color, I should say.
Right, right. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to kind of keep us, I guess, on this question, because it was also resonating from some things you were saying in season 2 with the turnover in teachers and principals that was happening, more so on one side of the Mason-Dixon line, but just some of the issues that came up there. So in your work, in your experiences, what can you tell us is maybe an optimal way to try to address this mismatch? What can people do to really work through some of this bias work, and be able to move closer to a match, to potentially understand their students better? You know, a teacher who's working in a district that is not their home district, that is very different than where they go home to at night.
Well, I think I actually would start to answer that question, not really like taking off my journalist hat a little bit, because this is not necessarily something that we asked people about when we were reporting either season of this show. Specifically, I will say, as somebody who's just like, as a journalist, but also as a teacher and other parts of my life, thought a lot about the biases and stereotypes that I hold, because I think we all do. I think the important thing for me, when you approach these questions of like, what kind of biases and filters do I have? What kind of stereotypes do I hold? It's very easy for that to lead to a place of either shame or resistance, or both, right? You know, oh, I have this personal shame because I have these stereotypes and these biases, or like, no, you're telling me that I have these biases and stereotypes. Absolutely not, I don't. And I think it's important to sort of take it out of that realm of kind of individual psychology like that. Not that we shouldn't hold people accountable for their actions, but part of what I think our show does, I'd like to think that our show does, is peel back some of the layers of where those stereotypes and biases come from. Because what that helps me to do is notice the bias and stereotype that I have in my head and be like, okay, that's there, but I also am an adult and I have control over what I do with it. It's there because it's the water we drink. And I don't have to let it drive my choices or my actions. And having the kind of context that I think Mark and I try to provide with our show helps, I think, is helpful for that, because then I could say, well, of course I have those biases and stereotypes, because everything about the way that I live is conditioned by policies and practices that were put in place long before me by powers that are far beyond me, that have created the conditions of my entire life. And so the condition of the media that I took in, and the media that was not made available to me, conditioned the people that I was around, the people that I was not around. And I think that's a really important part of the puzzle when thinking about bias and stereotype. And then back to your question, thinking about how to navigate a mismatch. Mark, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Okay,
happens to the best of us.
I would just say that when Max and I were first thinking about how to tackle these questions that you gave us, we wanted to acknowledge that teachers are asked to do so much, right? It's hard enough that you're in the classroom and you're trying to be effective and you're trying to get your lesson plan, you're trying to deal with, behavioral issues and differentiations in learning. But then you've got to, as we're suggesting, be aware of history and all these different socioeconomic factors impact on students. And it's a lot. And I guess the only thing I can say in that situation is kind of pile on in the sense that I think that, teachers are not expected to sort of, you know, I can say this because I've been married to a teacher. My parents, many people in my family were teachers, members of the UFT, that you're just not expected to sort of push back and to question. And I would just encourage people to the extent that they can, whether it's through their union, whether it's through individual, whether they can do it with their APs, their principals, however they do it, is if you see the kinds of things that we're talking about as far as imbalances, if you see structurally the way in which there are some oppressive factors in the school, I would just urge you to say something about it. And whether it's to an administrator or to, you know, someone in the department or whatever, that feel like, try to empower yourself to not just accept the status quo. I know that's, again, that's asking even more than what we've been talking about up to this point. But I think that it's important for teachers, what we have seen in different instances through the course of the 2 seasons, is that teachers and administrators have made a difference and in many ways have struck back against the status quo.
Okay. Well, thank you. Many thanks to both of you for spending some time with us here in Illinois. As I said, this is kind of our first step. This is our initial webinar. We're going to continue looking at this topic, and we really appreciate you spending time with us, giving us some of the background, some of the knowledge that you've gained, and helping us with some advice moving forward. So thank you to you both.
Thanks for having us, and check out the show.
All right.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
So as we are finishing up this first webinar, we have a few self-reflection questions that we want to leave with you, and also all of the wonderful information and advice that Max and Mark shared from their experiences, again in a different context, but and I encourage you to listen to their podcast. They are both seasons in New York, in again, one in Brooklyn, one in Queens. But I think it definitely resonates for things that we're looking at here in Illinois as well, things that we're looking at individually in our buildings, in our districts, in our communities. So I have a few self-reflection questions here, just again to kind of think about, and looking again at each of our understanding from being a teacher, an administrator, the other school-related professionals that all of you are, to think about how that all combines into behavioral expectations for our students, looking at ways we can learn more about our own views and being able to respect and understand the views of others on the topic. And then the last question is looking at, again, that larger piece of looking at the culture that we have around behavioral expectations, looking at our student code of conduct, looking at informal practices that are in our programs and buildings, and their potential impact. And as I said in the continuing webinars, and I'll give you a very brief overview of what's coming in the next few months. There are 3 additional webinars that focus on this first topic. November 16th will be the next one, which will be looking at more of a contextual lens. Today was kind of putting our toes in the water on the personal lens, November 16th, and the next one will be on December 21st, which takes us through a more professional lens in terms of looking at legal and ethical requirements. And then in January will be more of a kind of a hands-on planning session. And I also wanted to mention that in November, the special guest will be actually a local teacher here in Southern Illinois, who works at a middle school here in Carbondale, which is where SIU is located, who has some phenomenal insights from working with students with significant behavioral needs in a variety of settings, and what he has learned from his students that have impacted his expectations in his classroom and have really made huge and positive impacts on his students. For the December session, our special guest will be a lawyer. He is located in the central part of the state and has worked with many families looking into issues around school discipline and again, tying back into our conversations around behavioral expectations. And then, as I said, in January, I'll walk you through some steps toward an action plan. And as Michelle mentioned earlier as well, we do some work. Part of the grant is also working with school districts. So if you are involved in that piece of it or interested in that piece, I think jumping on for the webinar on the action plan will also be very useful, especially if it is yourself and other team members that you work with around students with behavioral needs. So I don't think we have any questions. So I also, again, want to repeat Michelle asking once we're completed, there's some next steps with the exit survey. So Michelle, did you want to hop back on for a second to kind of give a reminder about that?
Yes. So I just wanted to thank everyone for participating. Please check your email, even your spam email, for our exit survey and for the ISB evaluation tool. I would expect the exit survey should arrive in your email tomorrow, along with the ISB evaluation tool separately. So we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can people still hear us, or are we done? Does the recording end?
Let me stop.